and welcome to another episode of Doubl3Tap. Today we are joined by three usually undisclosed entities, but happy to have them on the show today. Fleet, Heimdall, and Flam. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Good.
Doing great.
Good. Good to be here.
Sweet. For those unfamiliar, these three are the co-founders of a fully on-chain gaming project called Citadel. I'm going to attempt to give a very brief elementary description of Citadel. Essentially, you guys are building a sci-fi MMO, but the important part is that it's decentralized, player-driven, player-owned, permissionless, and hopefully is going to last forever. So we're going to get pretty nerdy today. I'm looking forward to it. Before that, though, quick disclosures out the way. None of the content on this show should be considered as financial advice. It's for informational and educational purposes only. The views shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may have investments in some of the entities or assets mentioned in the show. With that out the way, gentlemen, what games are you currently playing?
Most recently, I started a new Elden Ring run of like a strength and faith build. I played The Last of Us Part 1 for the first time on my Steam Deck and beat that. Incredible. And then rewatched the entire show as well. Also great. And then usually on most of the investor calls that I'm on, I'm playing Doubl3Tap, that poker roguelike game. It's usually what I'm playing instead of responding to Alex.
Any other juicy suggestions? Any other good games we're playing?
Yeah, I haven't gotten too much lately, but my most recent thing was just revisiting some old player-run shards on Ultima Online, the game that I just can't completely let go of. I hope I have like a ridiculous catalog at this point on Steam. It's pretty shameful. I really hope to make a dent in it soon.
Yeah, as for myself, I haven't really been playing too much lately. I think the last thing I hopped on was Counter-Strike 2.
So on-chain games, putting assets on-chain, ascribing value to these assets, it means inherently those games are financialized. So curious how you guys think about that in terms of game design for Citadel. So in other words, as you financialize parts of the game, how does that change the way in which you design games?
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of different things people find different or interesting about on-chain games in different directions. But I think two of the things you're always going to get, kind of whether you want it or not, is the fact that they're going to be inherently financialized. So you're going to have to contend with that one way or another. And the idea that they are also by default, they say, permissionlessly extensible or interoperable. And then maybe depending on what other decisions you make, you get ideally some strong degree of decentralization or credible neutrality or long-term persistence. But at a minimum, with the inherent financialization and permissionless extensibility, I think, the question is that we think about a lot, what is that going to actually uniquely unlock? My guess is what the most interesting implications of that really end up being probably haven't been discovered yet, which is in a way pretty exciting. But I think what I do think those discoveries and some of the ideas we have now have in common is that they're going to leverage the ability for players to introduce their own incentives to a live running virtual world in a way that hasn't been possible before. The combination of real world liquidity entering the world with the permissionlessness and the extensibility running on top of a trustless self-executing programmable base layer is going to allow players and community builders to play, in a way, kind of play with one of the most important aspects, I think, of game design, which is the design and offering of incentives. So what does that look like in practice? Again, probably like the coolest stuff hasn't been built yet, but we can imagine a few things in our world, which is sort of this open world sci-fi setting in a big giant megastructure, and it's going to have a bunch of different environments built within it. And since we want everything to be sort of maximally player driven, we could imagine player created custom guilds, clans, corporations, and the alliances thereof, creating their own social structures and membership requirements and advancement and ranking systems, maybe that even have baked in automatic reward systems, so that they can kind of define the incentives that would like optimize the functioning of their social structures, their societies that they're building. That's definitely something you can't do in regular MMOs and stuff right now. Another example is, in our world, you're going to have the ability to openly engage other players as a spaceship in their spaceship. So, you could imagine if you're a pirate ship and you come across some merchant or mining vessel and you're not quite sure of their capabilities, you think you could probably get them. But, what if instead of just blasting away on the outset, which is kind of the only option in most games, you could send them a request to say, look, if you meet my requirements that I'm going to programmatically define in this template I have lying around, that you will grant us a certain amount of your cargo, we will guarantee programmatically that we will not be physically be able to fire upon you for the next hour. We'll get our loot, you'll get away with your life and your ship, and you can 100% trust that that's actually going to be honored, because we're playing with like the core rules of the world, but both agreeing on how those should apply. So it could be the other way around too, where a vessel being pursued could make a plea deal and be like, look, I'll give you some stuff if you don't blow me up. And that's, that's also kind of automatically enforced, which is just also a really interesting design space. Another one we think of as player created quests and missions, where ideally both the creator of the quest and the quester have something real and legitimate and relevant to the world to gain from it being completed. Like, say patrolling an area that's important to you to keep it safe for miners or something for X period of time. That's something where, once again, you're incentivizing behavior in the exact way you benefit. And then there's all kinds of other relationships like that with things like escrow mechanics, where if you put up some amount of value, some amount of assets in escrow, and then you can link that to all kinds of triggers. So say you're in an alliance and every member of the alliance has to put up some kind of stake, where if one of the other members breaks the alliance by attacking another, then they lose that stake, or that stake gets sent somewhere or burned. So, I mean, that's the kind of design space where I think the financialization actually could result in some really interesting things that have nothing to do with just like blind play to earn type of things that were really superficial.
A lot of the things you listed off, they sound cool, but are they not achievable in like a Web 2 environment? And is there something that like the blockchain rails adds to that programmable experience? I guess you could say like the decentralized nature of it, permissionless, and those types of things, right? Is that the line of thinking that you take, or is there something else?
Yeah, I mean, you could add many of those things in an existing Web 2 game. I mean, but the fact is, you couldn't extend them yourself. You would have to wait for the developer to provide that for you, And to date, most of those examples, if not all of them, have not been provided by any developer that I can name. So I think the idea is maybe those aren't even the coolest things that could be done by players, that could be offered by players. And then the other part of it is just the customizability of it. There's going to be a lot of things where a developer is never going to take the time and effort to solve your problem. They might solve a problem that applies to enough of a threshold of the population. If 30-40% of players are screaming and whining about something, maybe they'll finally give it to them. But if one player organization has a unique problem or wants a unique advantage, they have the tools to fix their own problems in novel ways, which once again is also potentially a competitive advantage, which becomes part of the design space. And once again, without that ability, that sort of infinite extensibility and custom solution and incentive design, you would not be able to have.
I'm curious. It seems like there's a lot of different ways you can go with this, but from like a workflow perspective, how do you guys determine, hey, here's the tools that we want to give players so they have the sandbox to operate within what we imagine, but then here are additional tools that enable players to think beyond maybe the extent that the team has imagined? Like, how do you think about giving players those tools in terms of designing the game, so that way, in the future they can kind of, let their imagination run wild? Flom gave us a couple of great examples about, things that maybe the Citadel team conceives of today. But I think the allure of something like this is, hey, there's a lot of things that players will conceive of that they'll create themselves to create a new version or derivation of the world that you guys might have envisioned. So from like maybe from like a developer or a player kind of UX perspective, I'm curious how you try to plant those tools within the game, so that way the design space can look one way maybe today as you envision it, but then tomorrow or in the future, it's something that players can really sink their teeth into.
I think part of it is just a type of by default answer, where the fact that the game is fully on chain, where every item, action, just entity in the entire game is addressable via smart contracts, because they are smart contracts, gives players that kind of programmable reality to at least approach imagining that. That's like, the by default, the thing that will ever give, the canvas that players will ever begin to have those thoughts. I think the way it starts in terms of giving players the tools and or further inspiring them to think outside the box or beyond those tools is things like one of the examples Flam talked about, where you have totally bespoke player created organizations or social groups. Things like, the idea is in World of Warcraft or EVE Online and WoW, every guild is run exactly the same from one another in terms of the framework, because that's what the frame, the defined developer setting is from Blizzard. Or EVE, every corporation's run the same. The idea in Citadel, that the point being, people can get really creative on the permissionless side because the way they structure themselves is exterior to the game but can interface with the game. That being said, what you do or how you encourage that is you provide a bunch of templates. Or in WoW and EVE, they don't have to provide a lot of templates for corporations or guilds or player groups, because there only really needs to be one. What you do here is you provide a template for things like an in-game DAO or an in-game corporation, as in the corporations we have in real life, like a business or a nonprofit or a literal dictatorship. There's no reason why people won't want to follow a single strong leader in a space sci-fi game, right? So you see those types of ideas, that variety or that customizability is present, while also equally putting next to them the idea that they could create their own, modify these, take these templates and extend them, and or browse the community to see what everyone else has done if they've shared anything. Good examples like Figma files. You open Figma to design interfaces, but there's a whole community tab of Figma where you can go look at everyone else's shared. Imagine that, but for player organizations, just a swath of options for people to get creative and imagine how they might structure things, and then repeat that for a bunch of other areas, things like quests, things like those ship-to-ship agreements that Flame was talking about, or escrow mechanics. Just the idea that these are very easily replicable by players, but also expanded. I don't know if that answers it, but I feel like that's my gist of a take.
So what are some of the types of like player run organizations or like governance structures that you guys think will be the most popular initially? And then which ones do you think people will maybe initially gloss over, but then over time gain a little bit more of an affinity for?
That's one of the things I was writing about a little earlier today and explaining to someone, but like I think the initial ones we want to provide are the obvious: a DAO, a corporation, a democracy, a dictatorship. Those are pretty four strong pillars of how people tend to organize themselves just in general in real life. I think the exciting thing is kind of what Flame was talking about earlier, where it's like all the cool stuff that is really what hasn't yet been discovered. And I think when we're talking about the idea of social structures, if players had the agency to be creative, I imagine when it comes to virtual worlds and very unique, interesting virtual games like what Citadel is, or WoW, or any other game, these social structures that would actually emerge are probably vastly different over a longer period of time than what we see in real life. I think it's super exciting.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll add is that there's been a lot of interesting experiments with governance in crypto, because it seemed like that was one of the things that was uniquely, applicable to. But it's been tough with finding a use case for those on-chain governance mechanics, because what are you ruling over or governing that's on-chain? And so now when you can put an entire virtual world on-chain, all of a sudden you have all of that to play with. And so I think in a way we get a preview into what society would look like if you had the power of smart contracts running everything.
So another thing that commonly comes up in the conversation of on-chain games is, hey, every single thing is on-chain, every in-game action is on-chain, etc. But I feel like you guys have a little bit of a unique take on this, where you feel like there's this line, or maybe this gray area, that defines what should be on chain and what should be tokenized. Curious if you guys could maybe talk a little bit more about how you think about that, and why maybe some other people might be thinking about this in the wrong way.
Yeah. So all of the unique characteristics of on-chain games, including financialization, introduce both novel challenges and novel opportunities. So I think the question that we've been grappling with for some time now is, what are some of those novel opportunities, provided you could solve enough of the major challenges? But in speaking of the challenges, I think one of the more common problems that will likely come up, or may has already come up, is the question of how you approach your on-chain game objects or assets themselves. This aspect gets a lot of hype around ownership and things like that, and we definitely are excited about how everything being fully on-chain helps the ownership argument around on-chain assets. But there is some challenges. I mean, despite the desire to want to maximize the potential for emergence and composability and interoperability that tokenizing things may get you, it can be pretty hard to reconcile all of that with the reality of game design. So it turns out to actually be pretty hard to deal with, at least in our kind of persistent virtual world type of title that we're building from a game design perspective. And I could probably point to a few problems. One of them is that allowing items to be taken in and out of the world into like some ethereal meta layer of someone's wallet could potentially break a lot of the spatially bound parts of the game that make the world interesting. So, for example, normally if you want to move space cargo from one part of the world to another, that's a really important part of the core loop that would involve the physical journey that takes time and probably involves a fair amount of risk in our world as you venture out into potentially wild territory. Now, if you can just simply trivially withdraw that same cargo as an NFT into your wallet and then plop it back into some other part of the world, you've just broken the spatial integrity of the world and that constraint that drives all kinds of interesting in-world trade-offs and mechanics, including things like, the value of goods at local markets and I could say the whole career path of the space trucker. So there's probably ways you could try to prevent that kind of thing, but I think to us it just felt like you were continually plugging holes in a leaky boat economically and game design wise, rather than just changing the core design pattern. So we're taking the approach that minimizing the amount of things that we tokenize and leaving as many things sort of world bound that are still on chain, but that are basically bound to the world itself, makes more sense for us than trying to tokenize every last thing. And this has interesting and beneficial economic implications as well, such as the fact that you're driving more liquidity to much fewer assets. So, for example, for us at launch, we plan to drive most of the out-of-world liquidity to our primary in-world currency, which is going to be OR, and that is an ERC20 token, and that can be used in the game for things like manufacturing fees, manufacturing and marketplace, and you can bid in the governance auctions. But the point is, all those things kind of fall into this one ERC20 token that is one of the few things that can leave the world, rather than liquidity and attention being spread across dozens and dozens of resources and tokenized assets. So I think that makes more sense for us. One last benefit is that this also allows us more control over the economy, and we're able to capture really most of the value and economic activity because it's all sort of happening in the world and bound to the world with things like taxes and fees and royalties, which is something we kind of lost the ability to do with just regular NFT trading. I don't know if you have anything to add, Connor.
Just I'll add on to what he said about driving the liquidity to the token. You can think of it like the entrance to the ecosystem, and I think that's really beneficial because you can have a much more robust liquidity pool. You have more demand coming into your token because in order to get the liquidity into the game, you literally need to go through the token. So I think that's something a lot of games get wrong by having all these distributed assets. It can be very confusing. It can disperse the liquidity across a bunch of assets, which makes your main currency less robust, less in demand. And so I think it's one thing that could be critical.
How are you guys kind of viewing like your target market, the size of it, what their spending power is, and like what makes this an economically viable sort of business?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first step is to give most wallets, at least Ethereum wallets, if you're in that ecosystem, a really good reason to check it out and be involved in some level. I think one of the interesting thing about a virtual world, an on-chain virtual world project, is it's not just either you're in the world or you don't touch it. I think there's a lot of touch points across the social layer, the governance layer, the contribution layer, the economic layer, as well as the actual, diving into the game part. So I really don't think we've seen the full promise of everything that crypto and blockchains and smart contracts can really do when it has an awesome use case that I think it was absolutely best applied to. And I think what it's one of the things it's really good at is addressing, virtual society. So, I mean, maybe I'm a little overly exuberant on that, but I really think at a minimum we need to get who's already here, who already kind of believes in the crypto ideal, or at least is interested in what it can do for them economically, into crypto native virtual worlds. And I think the potential of that, the TAM of that, is already, I think pretty substantial, to the point where the impact and the returns just from that is going to be non-trivial, particularly when you consider the value per player that is probably going to be involved in these kinds of worlds. Being inherently financialized, you're going to need a lot less players than traditional games, off-chain games, to make the same level of returns. So capturing who's already here, I think there's tremendous value there. Now, the other part of this is that I think once someone launches and can genuinely bootstrap a rich and interesting on-chain world with all of the qualities that we like about an on-chain is on display, and that is legible enough to a more general audience, like they can actually understand what's going on when they look at it. I think at that point there's going to be just way too many fascinating, wacky, wild narratives that are going to be coming out of that world to be ignored, even if people don't want to ignore it. Don't want to acknowledge it, and they would rather pretend it didn't exist, and they find the whole idea off-putting. I think the stuff that's coming out of it is just going to be too interesting to ignore, especially to curious creators and streamers, because it has all the stuff that makes for great stories and content and streaming. It has really high stakes. It has unexpected victories and defeats and treachery and tragedies, unlikely heroes, social drama, plus community involvement. So I think there's going to be a tipping point where once we have a cool enough world, it's doing enough of the things that we think it can do right, there's going to be a point at which it just starts becoming its own phenomenon. And that point will start pulling in, I think probably more mid to hardcore, but certainly sizable portion of Web2 gamers.
What do you think is one of the biggest blind spots that you can field this from the gamer POV or the developer POV that people have regarding on-chain games?
I think one of the biggest blind spots, at least from a developer's perspective, is I'll say for both developer and from an outsider's perspective, on-chain gaming. So for the outside view of on-chain gaming, you see people talk about, well, on-chain games are not scalable. What are you talking about? You have a transaction every action or state change, like that just doesn't make sense. Like, and they're right. You're never going to get the Fortnite or CS:GO of on-chain gaming. Maybe in a 10,000 or 20,000 TPS scenario. Who knows, right? But especially, that extends even to the people who are already developing on-chain games, in my opinion. And kind of what I was just saying in the last part is just that this is such an underdefined and misunderstood area of gaming, both in game design as equally as game development, that you have a lot of teams and a lot of projects approaching the ways they're building these games as like their traditional games just put on chain, when in reality you have to think more like what EVE Online did when they first started. EVE Online's original thesis appeal, that their mission was, think about it, we're at the late 90s, early 2000s, and these crazy guys in Iceland want to make an MMO when MMOs are just getting kind of started, which is where you have a lot of ambition, but they want to make an MMO that is single shard, where everyone's playing in the same exact world and where players are the content and everyone's on the same shard. Every other MMO, multiple servers, capped player counts, different regions, scrap all that. They wanted everyone in the same world, interacting together, shaping the overall fabric of what's going on. And the way they were able to do that, and they launched in 2003, and they successfully did that, was that they built the game differently from any game that has ever been built before. They focused on a game design that supported that type of approach, and especially development-wise, but also just what the constraints were. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people miss when it comes to on-chain games, both as an outside view, but also as people who are currently in the space, is that they really struggle to see the types of games that can be built, because so far they've only ever really played games that are all made relatively the same. And maybe I'm being a little bit biased. I have 15,000 hours of playing EVE Online. It's my favorite game ever, and I think it's one of the best fits for on-chain gaming, both economically, but really more interestingly and unnoticed is just development-wise and how it was structured. And I think it's a really good example for how you get a high volume, high activity, extremely engaging, interesting game out of a very low amount of transactions or a very low amount of just different types of complexity. So yeah, TLDR, what successful on-chain games look like are not what normal games look like that we have played before. You have to look at the outliers. EVE Online's a great outlier. It's unlike anything else that's existed, and no one's ever been able to copy it. They've tried, but everyone has failed. Even CCP, after they launched EVE, they've never been able to recreate it themselves. There's a reason.
Have you done any forecasts or models on predicted per user spend? And if so, have you got a rough number of how many players you would need to start to sustain the game?
You would only need, in a game like ours, and again, I have to give credit to Heimdall. Heimdall's the fucking Excel spreadsheet genius who did a lot of all this forecasting, and I'll let him speak in a second. But you would only need maybe 10,000 players, just total, not active at once, not active every day, just 10,000 subscribed players roughly, with a really, really low conservative amount of, in-game trading, not putting money into the ecosystem, just trading things around and, engaging, to have a very substantial return for the ecosystem, not as developers. Obviously you take a cut of that, but it's impressive what you can do when you can utilize or monetize a valuable economy. I mean, again, the best business in the entire world is being a country. That's why the United States is number one. They tax their economy, and they have the highest value economy, which makes them the most powerful in the world. They have the most money, they have the most resources, and it's because they're able to monetize their economy. Virtual world's never been able to do that. And so if you can just have a relatively good amount of players, it's crazy how much value there is there, which you're not able to do in a Web2 game, because those are not things that it's just that they don't work like that. You don't have those default, rails for financialization or capturing that type of value. It doesn't work like that. But yeah, I don't know if Heimdall can probably expand, if he wants to add anything.
Yeah, so the number that Fleet Commander was referencing is based on us taking a minority share of the revenue that's generated by the game, which means if we took a larger percentage, it would work with even less players. The game's actually pretty sustainable with any number of players, just by the way it's designed and the way it captures value and keeps it within the ecosystem.
And that about wraps it up for today. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been incredibly insightful. I've taken some notes here. Like we've talked a lot about the emergent behaviors in like programmable worlds. How being fully on chain is actually bad game design. So yeah, thanks a lot, guys. It's been great chatting.
Yeah, likewise. Really, really fun time.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks, brother.
The content of this video is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. The views shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may hold investments in some of the companies or digital assets featured in the video.